Hello and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the city. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. On each episode of Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the honor and pleasure of getting to know over the course of my tenure at JCRC. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting the New York Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of our city, the state of our state, the state of the nation, and at times the state of the world. Today, we are joined, I'm excited to say that we're joined by two wonderful guests as we continue our Black History Month series. Two friends, Tamara Fish and Heather Miller. Tamara is the former president of the Jewish Multiracial Network and co-founder of Khazbar, if I pronounced it correctly. And Heather is, thank you, and Heather is an educator and president of the Flatbush Jewish Center. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great to have you. And I need to say right at the outset, for as much as I would like for Heather to be a relative of mine carrying the same family name, it appears from a previous conversation that we are not. But nonetheless, anybody who comes on to Community Relations Corner is family, and that includes Tamara as well. And we would love to hear more about you, about your background, where you were brought into this world, where you grew up. So we'll start with Tamara, then we'll head over to Heather. Tamara?
Okay. I am a proud Clevelander. Go Browns. Go the baseball team. That's
Indians. For now, they're still the Indians.
Still the Indians. There we go. And I came out east to go to school, go to college and grad school, and I had only the intention of staying here in New York City for about 2 years. That didn't quite work as planned. I've been here now for over 30 years, and in that range of time, I've served as a synagogue president, Congregation Tehillah, up in Riverdale, New York.
Yes.
And have found myself doing increasingly more and more work regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And a little bit more about my background will probably come out. I'm not very good at speaking about myself. So that's kind of seg to you, Heather.
Okay, Heather, for one synagogue president to another.
Right. I too struggle with this question in particular. I can talk for hours on other topics, but not myself. I am born and raised in Los Angeles, actually. And I also came to the East Coast to go to college and wasn't planning on staying. And 22 years later, that has not changed. I have been in Brooklyn for the past 18 years or so. And I am currently the president of the Flatbush and Sha'arei Torah Jewish Center in Brooklyn. And I have also decided to step out of just the work that I do on the synagogue level. I have been doing a lot more work with organizations, with our Jewish organizations, in order to push this, to be part of the momentum in order to make our Jewish communities safer and embracing for Jews of color. So I've been doing a lot of work around that, and I'm sure that will come up during this conversation as well.
Yeah, so actually let's let's dive into it. Clearly, you're both women of color. Clearly, you're both Jewish, part of the Jewish community. Can you describe for us a few times when these identities actually clashed, as well as opportunities where they sing in harmony? Heather, do you want to start?
Sure. I can't really think or pinpoint any moment in particular where they clash. I think that they're both essential parts of my whole self. When I think about how those two halves of my identity sing in harmony, I think that it's that I bring a different lens to our Jewish community, and I see things in different ways. The parshiot, I definitely see from a different perspective. Holidays, I see from a different perspective. But I think that part of that harmony for me is adding flavor to the community and to the perspective. So I think that that difference in perspective that Jews of color bring, or that I bring to the community, really adds to that beauty of inclusion that we have in our Judaism. So that's part of how I see it.
And Tamara, do you feel the same way, or?
Well, I'd like to turn the question on its head, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Because the question presupposes that there's a conflict, or that there could be a conflict.
Yes.
When, in fact, I think sometimes it's an analogy might work. Are there times when one's Jewish identity and one's American identity come into conflict? And if you frame it that way, then most of it is probably in harmony. But there are some rough edges. People that I know struggle, for instance, at times with Israel or Israel's politics, right? That might be a time when being American or being Jewish could come into conflict. And so I need to make this very clear that for the most part, the two, I would say, almost complement each other, much in the same way that you would have, let's say, a blue and a green overlapping to create this gorgeous, aqua, let's say. Mm-hmm. But there's sometimes when things don't gel. And if I could put it in a nutshell, it really is an issue that is at the heart of every religion, framed differently. If there's a point where we as Jews do not see B'Tselem Elohim, the image of the divine in the other, then that's a conflict. But is that a conflict of cultures, or is that a conflict of understanding what it means to celebrate life and to celebrate the divine in us?
So let me just focus in on that for a moment, Tamara. Sorry for interrupting you, but what are some of the experiences in Jewish life where there is that focus that brings out within you your identity, both as a member of the Jewish faith, complemented by your African-American heritage?
In a nutshell, it's usually when I'm approached with the assumption that one cannot be both Jewish and African-American. Okay.
Do people actually do that?
Imagine that. To show up at a bar mitzvah, for instance, and at a shul that I don't know, and be mistaken for janitorial staff. And yes, janitorial staff may be of very many different hues, often people of colors, but it's the assumption that I cannot possibly be Jewish. And so what's needed is a reorientation of perspective as to what is possible, recapturing what is in essence the nature of Judaism, which is a religion and a peoplehood that has spanned the entire world. Okay, from the small little place in the ancient Near East.
Right.
And the question then is, what keeps us from acknowledging what we know is true and is encoded in our sacred texts and our histories? That's the key.
Right. And so, Heather, what are those things that are encoded within our history and within our text that make you feel that the Jewish faith that you're a part of expresses itself vividly?
That expresses itself vividly. I think it's just such an ingrained part of my identity. I don't think about those two things being separate. They're not separate. They're not any separate for me than they are for you, I would imagine. They're not two distinct pieces. They live harmoniously between, within me. And I think I was just thinking about what Tamara was saying about Jewish spaces. And I think that those experiences do happen. I'll borrow a term from a friend of mine who, sorry, somebody just popped a message in the chat there, who refers to the experience as being bageled. I think that what happens is that when we walk into, and I've experienced this, walking into a community that's not my usual community, there's the people who will approach and try to determine my legitimacy, why I'm there, how I come to be there, and it's sort of as if I'm a unicorn. And it's just, so that can be very tiresome, because it's not different for me, just like it's not a different experience. I don't separate those two. There are definitely, I just have a different history.
It's interesting. One of our viewers just texted in, I've always been surprised that more African-American people are not Jewish.
I actually think that I think that there are probably more than people realize, because we have the data that shows that 12 to 15%, and it's being updated currently because there's a new survey that's out right now, but 12 to 15% of Jews in America identify as Jews of color. That's a significant number of people that we just don't see in our communities. And I think that one of the reasons we don't see that high percentage in the vast majority of our communities is because of those experiences that turn people away. And that is not what our faith is about. I think there's things that we pray every single day about inclusion and being a welcoming people and all of that. And Judaism is not supposed to hurt. And I think that it hurts for some people. And I think that that's something that, we need to change.
Oh, indeed. I speaking about experiences, I'm very curious, and we did not discuss this in advance, but it's not a trick question. I think it's an important one. We're about to celebrate Purim, but we're in a month going to be celebrating Passover, Pesach. And at the Pesach table, we have a Seder. And the Seder has a Haggadah, and the Haggadah is a liturgy, and the liturgy talks about the end of slavery and emerging into freedom. Do you in any way view that story of from slavery to freedom any differently than somebody who's of Eastern European heritage?
Oh, certainly. So I mentioned that there were things that I just see through a different lens. This is one of them.
Please talk about it.
Avadim Hayenu definitely is different because my people are not yet free. Slavery in my history is different. It's, I don't want to say bifurcated, but it's different, because they're just two completely different definitions of slavery to begin with. And so that is definitely a holiday that is a little bit different for me. Parshat Mishpatim, for example, it reads a little bit differently for me. And so I do think about that a lot. But the way I think about it is that when we have those moments in our liturgy where we are called upon to remember those moments, I think that we're supposed to remember that moment where that we read in Yitro a few weeks ago, where we received the Torah, right? The multitudes were at Sinai in that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Israelites were standing with people from different nations who all received the commandments in that moment and became Jews in that moment. And I think that when we conjure those moments, when we conjure that story, so for me, it is remembering a moment of more diversity and more pluralism than I think that we have today. We're still struggling with that. The fact that in that moment at Sinai, not everybody looked the same. I say, not one person at Sinai looked Eastern European. It would have made wandering the desert for 40 years pretty difficult. But I think that we forget the connection to those moments. And so for me, that's what I like to think about, because that story is a little bit differently. The Haggadah does read differently.
And Tamara, how does Haggadah speak to you?
Okay. I too arrive at a different point. Likewise, Heather and I share the background of being African Americans, right, in this country. Turns out that I can trace my family line back literally. We thought it was 8 generations. We've added another 4. We've been here for 12 generations. That's a long time. Okay. Now, within that, I think Americans now are just waking up to the reality of just how much of a trauma we're still living, the legacies of race and the legacies of race that started in slavery. So I've always found it very peculiar, very odd, on the one hand, to have a far more visceral, far more immediate connection, not only to slavery, but the ways in which that legacy of racism permeates my life, right? And being in the company of people who have an intellectual understanding of slavery may have a different visceral understanding of oppression, right, pogroms, Holocaust, but of slavery and its legacy, that is so far removed, right? And I always feel in that moment, yeah, we're not talking about the same thing here. And I don't understand if I can help bring you along to see what I see. And I sure as hell don't want to do that after 4 cups of wine, because I just want to celebrate the holidays. And I think that captures some of the in-between spaces. I don't see that as a conflict of identities. I see that as how Jews of different backgrounds find themselves in different spaces, and whether we will expand the community to hold all the stories.
Well, it would be quite interesting, I think, to be sitting at both of your seders and to hear from you as we go through the Haggadah, to go through the liturgy, what particular expressions of anguish or of celebration would mean. But there's one thing that I think that we all as Jews have experienced, but maybe your experiences have been somewhat different than mine, and that's anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. Before we went live, I mentioned I was in Queens this morning with the Queens Borough president, because there was a press conference, there's been a rise in both anti-Asian and anti-Semitic hate crimes. Have either of you or both of you experienced anti-Semitism? And is that anti-Semitism any different than what somebody who isn't a Jew of color might experience? Tamara, do you want to start?
Yes, I have actually experienced anti-Semitism, and it is a perverse role reversal for me in this country, because as an African American, I experience racism. It just happens. I know how to experience that. My parents have taught me how to navigate that ever since I was 7. Okay, and being called nigger on the playground. Okay, that is a space that unfortunately is familiar. Now, I came to Judaism as an adult. Okay, but I have to say that I never understood anti-Semitism in the first place. Anti-Black racism has historical roots in this country. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it has a context, and within that context, you can kind of see how it happens. But Jews in America, anti-Semitism, what is that about? It boggles my mind. And every time that I encounter it, my mind just goes zzz, on two levels. And this is what I'm talking about, role reversals. In the world out there, I am not seen as Jewish. So I am privy to anti-Semitic comments that come from a variety of people, including, and I hate to say this, from Black folk. And I still stop and wonder, where are you getting it? Where did this come from? And for a moment, I feel like an observer looking in on a situation that includes me, but the other person doesn't know it. And it makes me think sometimes of what happens when white people who are allies, all right, hear anti-Black remarks, and it's about their Black and Jewish friends, all right? Or even if they're not Jewish, just how does that process? So I have to say that on a gut level, I just feel completely flummoxed because I don't understand why it exists.
And Heather, for you?
I mean, yes, I have definitely experienced both. And it's the same in the outside because of that unicorn syndrome in the outside world. And I can't even say, and also the inside world, because the unfortunate reality of racism, and this taps into the other work that I do on helping communities raise their race consciousness, is that I have experienced a lot of racism within the Jewish community. And so that's the hardest thing for me. The first time that my children were called the N-word or experienced racism was at their day schools. And so that's heavy for me. I think that that's where the cognitive dissonance exists for me, is being in a place where is that I have two identities that both have such a history of oppression and violence and intergenerational trauma, and yet one group does discriminate so heavily against the other half. And so if I were to pick a time when it clashes, it's not for me, it's that even in the safety of my Jewish community, not all Jewish communities are safe, because then there's the racism. So I have to deal with racism outside. I have to deal with anti-Semitism outside. But when I am in a space that is supposed to be a sanctuary, and then I get racism in that Jewish community, that's when the identities clash for me.
And how do we deal with that? Or
that's this moment that we're in. I think people coming to the realization that the history that we learned in school was incomplete. It stopped at the wrong point. People were able to bury their heads in the sand and not experience empathy for a group of people who is still being oppressed to this moment. And I think that that's one of the things that these pandemic conditions created, the ideal situation where people didn't have anything to do but to listen. We couldn't go anywhere. So there was no hustle and bustle of everyday life to bury a story because we're all at home. And so I think that the more our communities are willing to learn and to dig deep and to own and recognize that though that race gets complicated in the Jewish community, because Judaism is not a race, it's part of our ethnic identities, and that there are Jews of Ashkenazi descent who benefit from white privilege. And to own that and be real about that, and to recognize how racism out in America is replicated in our Jewish communities every time a Jew of color enters a space and somebody treats them as if they don't belong or questions why they don't belong. So I think that that's the growth, and being able to do that hard work. The communities that I've worked with, there's somebody who sent us a chat message that attended one of my race consciousness series, and to really be able to turn that mirror inwards and say, these are these things, and these are the biases that I didn't realize that I held, and this is how it comes out when I'm greeting new people at the door. I think that that's how we make change, is to continue to just grapple and be in that uncomfortable space and want to get through it so that we can be a more embracing community.
Right. So within that grappling, Tamara, white privilege is the general Jewish community, folks like me who are of Eastern European heritage. Are we the same in terms of white privilege as other Americans who are Caucasian? And
Well, that's a very interesting and very insightful question, but ironically, that question is not for me. That is a question for you and other people who identify as white to answer and to probe, right? And I think one of the hardest things is that in this culture, in our American culture, we're all raised to be the heroes, right? We're all on the right side of history. We're all the people who saved Europe from the ravages of the ongoing ravages of Hitler. I mean, there is a lot to be proud on, and we really thrive on this mythos, on this idea of what it means to be American. And that is fine, and that is good, but it has its drawbacks. And the drawback here is that it doesn't allow us sometimes to watch how we live. So I could answer that, and what would that mean? Rather, the process of asking the question is essential. What happens is that it seems to me, and this is open for discussion, I would love to discuss this, that American Jews who can be identified as white live in a liminal space, a betwixt and between space. On the one hand, having an identity, often from Europe, knowing what it's like to have been ground down in the dirt, knowing what it's like to have been oppressed, and yet being here in this land of opportunities, because why would you come here if it weren't a land of opportunities, and gaining those opportunities. And so with that becomes a different type of dual consciousness. At what point do you ride the wave of opportunity, and it's a great thing, and you work within the American culture, which says that there is a bottom caste, to work from Isabel Wilkerson, and says the success of America has been built on that bottom caste. Now, can you look at that? To what extent does that hold true? In what ways does it not hold true? With whom would you like to have this discussion? It's not the answer that matters, it's the process. And so I respectfully turn that question back to you.
Yeah, well, I think that we in the general Jewish community and the white Jewish community are not wrestling with that issue. I think that on a day-to-day basis, we're wrestling with anti-Semitism generally directed towards us, as opposed to what our own views may be. And how can someone who is targeted by, I say this rhetorically, how can someone who is targeted by anti-Semitism worry about their potential racism? So it's, or white privilege.
And the pushback that I give to that, however, is that we teach our children to remember the atrocities that have happened historically to the Jewish people throughout history. And to me, never again means never again for anyone. And that how can one want to fight against anti-Semitism and not also want to be anti-racist? They're not separate. It's not separate fights. At the end of the day, the same white supremacists who are shooting up our synagogues are setting fire to Black churches. They hate us both the same. And so we do understand our oppression and our oppression stories. It's not an oppression Olympics. We are, it's two identities. Like I say, my children are descended from both freed slaves and Holocaust survivors. Both of those histories flow through their veins. And so I think that it's remembering that in that moment that there is room, because that means the same empathy and the same fight that we have to battle against anti-Semitism in our world. We want that for everything else too, all other forms of hate, because we want to live in a world that is safe for everyone. And in our Jewish communities, when we think about it as one-sided as that, what happens is that we say that the story and the history of the Jews of color in those communities doesn't matter enough to give it attention. Because how does that sound when you have a Jewish community that has white Jews, and then you have Jews of color, and that the white Jews are taking the stance? How can we focus on racism right now because we have to deal with anti-Semitism? That's saying that the whole community doesn't matter.
So let me, as Hezra did to me a moment ago, let me turn the question around, or Tamara did. You both did, and Jews of color. Let's just deal with a little bit of a definition to help me, and I'm sure to help our many viewers. And that is, yes, I understand that somebody like myself, the Millers came from the Ukraine. That yes, we are white, as would be defined here, or Caucasian. But what about the Sephardic Jewish community? What about the Jews that came from North Africa, the Jews from Yemen, who can trace their lineage back a couple of thousand years? Are they also Jews of color, or is the term Jews of color really relegated to, let's say, Black Jews or Latino Jews or Eastern Asian Jews, but not, or Southern Asian Jews, but not Middle Eastern Jews? They are not Jews of color?
Well, I mean, so I don't like to identify other people for them. I think I have my answer on what I would think, and that 12 to 15% in that survey does not include Mizrahi Jews, doesn't include Sephardi Jews. So the number, as I would define it, would be much larger than that. I think that every community has the right to choose the identity that they have, but we do have to recognize that our Jewish community does include a lot of different views, a lot of different histories, a lot of different perspectives. And so Jews of color, I would say, includes all of that and all of those voices. And there is a lot of work to try to get more of those voices under that umbrella of Jews of color and try to get that out. Because I think what has happened is that Ashkenazi Jewry has defined Judaism in America on TV, like in our entertainment, in our community spaces. When you think of a Jew, you're not thinking of a Middle Eastern Jew. You're not thinking of somebody with Iraqi descent. So that's not what you're picturing in your mind. And so you're not
in America.
You're not picturing Tamara. And so I think that as we evolve that definition and recognize what has happened and how those identities formed in the first place, it leaves it open for more people to be included in those definitions.
Tamara, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, certainly. I've been a part of several different projects. Not only Jewish Multiracial Network, not only my own organization of Khazbar, not only the being part of the team that was looking at the latest academic survey put out by the JOI?
Yeah, the Jews of Color Initiative.
Jews of Color Initiative. Thank you so much, with Elena Kaufman. And the approach is I think is something we need to look at. Many Jews of color are very comfortable by saying, if you think of yourself as a Jew of color, okay, fine. That's fine. Because what is being identified is not necessarily strictly a racial group, but an orientation and an experience that says, despite my being Jewish, I have not been treated as, not been considered a Jew by how I practice or by how I look. And so the idea of the vessel of Jews of color is very wide, very, very permeable. And in many cases, yes, it does include indigenous, Mizrahi, Tzfadi, Latinx, etc. So we're not using a definition or a classification to say this is in and this is out. And perhaps that speaks a little bit also to the cultures that are involved, the cultures that have tend to be rather permeable. To what extent is one truly half Black in the society, right? Okay. So I would say, while the question is excellent, Jews of color typically don't get hung up on who is a Jew of color, but understanding that this cultural group exists and embodies Judaism literally in a different way, as Heather said, than what one would think in the mainstream American culture views it.
Well, I just want, again, make a little bit of a turn here from this conversation about Jews of color to back to your African-American heritage of the degree of your acceptance within the African-American community. I have found, and I don't want to generalize, but I've just seen by experience, so this is anecdotal, that accompanying African-American non-Jews to Israel, elected officials, community leaders, and we would visit with an Ethiopian Jewish community, that despite the fact that both families emanate from the African continent, there wasn't necessarily a linkage that was immediately evident between the two. Not that there necessarily had to have been, but I didn't see that. Are you, as Jews of color of African-American heritage, viewed or embraced by the general Black community, A, and then B, how does Black anti-Semitism impact on you? And are you in a better position to respond more effectively than those in the white Jewish community?
That's a very full question. I would say that it's complicated.
Yeah,
it is. It's just a complicated question. In there is also, there's a lot in that question. There's a lot to unpack there. I would say that I experience, as I operate and work in my day job, in a Black community. So there's a lot that I get to hear. And it is a complicated issue. And I think that for my identity, and I'll speak for myself as a Black woman, I think that the intersection of the Black and Jewish community, for me, it's that what the tensions between those two communities specifically is a whole other conversation that we cannot finish in the next 19 minutes.
Right.
And so there is a lot. There's a lot there between the Black and Jewish communities specifically that might be different for other Jews of color historically in America. And so that's a little bit more nuanced. And so when it comes to that, there are times where it's the same being an upstander for my people in those situations as well, and to dissuade some of the theory of the things that the hateful things that people have to say and the generalizations about Jews. I think that there's a lot of that. And like I said, I can't possibly begin to unpack that in the latter part of this conversation. However, it is complicated. There is a history of trauma between the two communities. I happen to be right now in Bed-Stuy, which is sneeze away from Crown Heights. So there's tension between the neighborhoods that make it so that I have that talk with my elder son in two different directions. When you're here, when he's walking home, because he is a Black Jew and he has the capability to be harassed by everyone as he's walking home in Crown Heights. And so I think that, it's different. It's a little bit different when it's the Black and Jewish community. And in terms of us, I I'm African by way of being brought here. My people were brought here on a boat. My people have been they've been American for a lot longer than other people have been American, by way of being transported without consent. So yeah, my mother refers, and I sort of like this acronym. I'm an American descendant of slavery. So that's different. I wouldn't call myself African because according to my 23andMe, there's a lot of places that could refer, there's a lot of countries that could come from.
All right, Tamara, and also if you can focus in on the whether you're in a better position to deal with Black anti-Semitism than a white Jew would be.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit.
Sure.
I think, the issue before was, tensions between like Jewish communities or Black communities, et cetera. I think it's very important to note that Black communities are every much as diverse as Jewish communities. So when we talk about tensions, what communities are we talking about? And as such, also living in the skin that I'm in for my entire life means that I navigate various Black communities well, right? Now, what happens when racism rears its head? And well, again, as someone who's been in this body for so long, yes, I know how to deal with that. And some of those skills are very much applicable to being able to counter the anti-Semitism that emerges within Black communities, various Black communities. I guess part of the question is, I'm not entirely quite sure where the outcome of that question goes. Okay. If Jews of color perhaps might have more skills than, let's say, some that perceive themselves as white in the Jewish community, then what? So I'm not sure what to do with that information. Okay. I do know that there are opportunities. We need to build opportunities for us as a whole Jewish communities of diverse identities to learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, Judaism is a religion of stories. And I think that the more we stop and listen, I mean, we say it literally a couple times a day when we say Shema, when we say Hear O Israel, all of us. And when we share our stories and recognize that the experiences, and we're just sharing our own experiences. But the experiences that we have, like this is part of the Jewish story. And if it's impacting a part of our Jewish community in a way, then it's impacting all of us because all of our histories are part of the Jewish people. And I think that that's important because otherwise it can sometimes be just exhausting. To get it on both ends sometimes.
I saw a question earlier in the chat, and thank you to the people who are sending in questions. It's just very difficult to keep up with all of them. But very early on, a person identified himself as a rabbi who doesn't acknowledge the Blackness of the Black Jews, the Jews of color who are in his congregation because they've given an indication that they don't want to be such acknowledged as such. So when does you've both been, or one is, Heather is a president and Tamara is a past president of a congregation. Is it your Jewishness that comes to the fore, or does it come to the fore complemented by your Blackness? Do you want to be recognized as being, forget about what we see, but who you are in terms of your character? Do you want to be recognized as Black Jews and in Jewish leadership? Or is Jewish leadership just enough of a burden for you? Tamara, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay. So I too, it's so hard. You're absolutely right. It's so hard to read and try to keep posted and try to keep up. And it was a rather large, long question, and rightfully so. It was very complex. I had a slightly different read on it, which was that the rabbi was saying that unless the other person brings up race, he doesn't want to acknowledge it because he wants everyone to be treated the same way. I said I'm not sure if that was correct. I thought it was a
I
mess.
think that probably is correct, but
Okay,
I like my question too.
Okay, it's a good question. But it does beg the question, as you say, at what point do you want this acknowledged? First of all, I want to commend the rabbi for walking the walk. Many times I've heard of other African-American Jews say they just want to be treated like everybody else. And for the most part, that's fine, except there are instances where who we are as people matter. Let's flip the script. There are times, for instance, when being a woman matters as one is a Jew, right? And so not to have an ironclad rule saying, I will never mention, I think it would be helpful to, yes, continue to treat everyone as you would everyone else and ask, listen, I haven't made an issue of your background, your ethnic background. I understand there might be some questions or issues or things that you've run into. I want to be here for you to support all of who you are, to support all of who you are. And that way, what we're actually doing is saying, ask. You can even preface it by saying, my intention is to be helpful and not harmful. If this hurts, please let me know. But this is where I'm standing. This is what I'm seeing. This is why I'm asking the question. Ask the questions. That shows the beginning of trust. We as a community must work on trust and trust that the community can hold all of us, even when we make mistakes. Mm-hmm. That's how we bind together.
Okay.
And I think that it depends on really what the intent is, and everybody gets to choose.
That's right.
How far they want to be. You know, myself and Tamara have made the decision to be Black Jews who are out in front of rooms. Not everybody wants that spotlight. Not everybody wants to share so much of themselves. Because sometimes you just want to go to shul, take out a siddur and pray. But I think that when we're thinking about it, if the intent is because we're trying to hold on to that identity, that identity as a colorblind society, that's not recognizing that there could be things happening in a community that can be exclusive. And I think that it's the same questions that we asked in the communities when, depending on your brand of Judaism, when the role of women changed, and women were able to take a greater part in the community, then leadership had to change because women have to be at the table. When we became more embracing of the LGBTQI community, things have to change. So I think that sometimes it's a matter of who's at the table, who's help making decisions, who's in the leadership, how other things, building security, all of those things. It's just the different lenses that exist. And if a person does not want to be tokenized or doesn't want to be part of that conversation, you respect that person. But that doesn't mean that you don't plan to be inclusive of that community.
So what additionally needs to be done to ensure that Jews of color, JOCs, are reflected within Jewish leadership? Obviously, within the two congregations that you have led and continue to lead, yes, but generally speaking, it appears not. What needs to be done? Is there an effort being made now organizationally, organically, within the Jews of color movement per se, that will lead to a rising up of leadership from the JOC world to penetrate into the general Jewish community, where regrettably there is an absence of such representation.
Well,
Tamara?
we're here. The leaders are here. So where is the action really needed? There are many of us, we do talks, we've been in positions of leadership, we know everybody, right? We need the shidduch from the other side as well. Okay? We can't lift the entire community by ourselves, but together we can do amazing things. And so it's shifting from that intellectual idea of we love diversity to, okay, let's roll up the sleeves, let's get to work. Okay, how do we make this work? How do we do two things at the same time? One, acknowledge that at some point, okay, this is what I love to say, at some point, we're in this American culture. And American culture is infused with racism. Now, culture is a marinade. We are tofu. We are not responsible for the marinade that we've been dipped into, but we've absorbed it. Now that we see it, we can cut off parts of it and decide we want a different marinade. But it requires that we see the marinade. It requires that we look at all of our Jewish communities and say, wait a minute, this is not us. And then make the steps to make that change. That involves changing a culture. Be clear what the issue is. We are embarking on a change of culture, which will not happen overnight, but we've got to start somewhere. And that's where I say, I love Perke Avot 2:4. Okay.
Right.
We are not tasked with completing it, but we can't desist from it either.
We can't desist from it.
Our work is never done. When we say justice, justice shall you pursue, it is something that we are actively always striving for, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a thing that the work, so, I have had the privilege to be able to run this race consciousness series and touch over 40 communities plus and counting. I have one tonight with a group of teens. And I think that every time someone listens and wants to be part of doing that really deep, intense work, it's creating a ripple of that, it's creating a wave of change. And it gives me hope that all these communities want to do the work to be more inclusive and recognize the places where they may not have seen that there was a voice that they were not even intentionally trying to exclude. And so that gives me hope that one day my kiddos or my grandkids will just be able to walk into any synagogue and just not be like, what are you doing here? But just be a part of the community, just like everybody else. Because there's a lot of people a lot of Jews of color who because of all of these experiences that they've had interdenominationally, have made it so that they're not living full, connected Jewish lives. And as a Jewish mother, I don't ascribe to every single gender role that we have, but that's a big one. We are supposed to be raising good Jewish children who are good humans that we release out into the world. Hopefully, like all of those values that we have, we want to make sure. When I think about this, when I say Hashkivenu at night, and I am hoping that, when my soul is out there, I'm also thinking about what I'm reflecting on what I did during the day to contribute to making the world and our Jewish world a better place. And when I get my soul back in the morning, I'm like, okay, God, I'm going to try to do better today. And I think I take those prayers and those sections of our liturgy very seriously. And I think that that's one of the things that every time a community wants to bring me to them, I'm hopeful that this will just be a memory, that there will be a time when we just see a lot of different faces in our communities. That will be normal.
Tamara, do you want to weigh in on that? Because we're running out of time in our hour.
I would just say, I agree wholeheartedly with everything Heather said. We make a good team, Heather. We should do this again. But I would just say, yes, it is hard and it's a challenge when one is so comfortable in the community and the nature of the Jewish culture as it exists now, to have to hear it's time to change, it's time to shake things up. And no one wants to do that. If you find your comfortable little niche, who wants to do that? But imagine if there's a brighter future out there, but we can get there only if we get there together. So we have to stretch, we have to grow. It will hurt, but like a good run, I'm not a runner, like a good run, it can be exhilarating.
Well, I think that this conversation is like a good run, which I have been in my time, and a good run is exhilarating. And not only that, I've always found when I do run that it just clears my mind, clears my head. I see things much more in focus than I did previously, and I think that the two of you have really brought the issue of Jews of color into much sharper focus than we were before we started this conversation, especially since we're doing it during a Black History Month. It has all the more meaning, and I'm sure for the Black community, certainly for the Jewish community, every month is Jewish Heritage Month. So the combination and the intertwining of the two, and of both of your stories, of both of your explanations, and discussion and conversation means one thing: we have to do this again. This was just scratching the surface, and I think as Heather just wrote in the chat, we've discussed reality here. There are many other dimensions to reality, which hopefully we'll get to in the next conversation. So I cannot thank Tamara and Heather enough for joining us for the past hour. We hope that everybody who's listening has gotten a tremendous amount from this conversation, at least as much as I have, and hopefully beyond. I look forward to furthering our discussion in the future. And for now, I want to wish both of you a Chag Purim Sameach, a very happy Purim. And if I don't speak to you before Pesach, a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. And thank you so much for joining us on Community Relations Corner. And we look forward to next week's episode as well. Shalom to everyone. Thank you so much to Heather and Tamara. Bye-bye. Shalom.
Bye. Thank you.